If someone ever asks what Germany, Lithuania, the Netherlands, and the Soviet Union have in common, you could answer the Landsverk 181 and you would be right. In 1933, the Swedish company Landsverk released its new six-wheeled armored car on the defense market, which caught the attention of two neutral countries, Lithuania and the Netherlands. Both countries acquired the armored cars, and both were, unfortunately, subsequently occupied by Germany and the Soviet Union, which inherited their Landsverk stock. Thus, despite low numbers produced, the Landsverk 181 found itself in the service of four different nations, being used on multiple fronts until the end of the war. First, let's quickly go back to the origins of armored vehicle design by Landsverk. As you probably know, Germany's military industry was heavily restricted after the First World War. To evade some of the sanctions, assets were moved abroad, and Landsverk was one of the companies that came under German influence, which dragged them into armored vehicle development later on. This then led to the L170 and L185, both four-wheeled armored cars, which were designed in accordance with specifications issued by Sweden and Denmark respectively. The design that would follow, known as the L181, would, in its commercial form, be created without a specific customer in mind. As is pretty common today, an existing mass-produced chassis was chosen as a base. Landsverk went with a German Mercedes-Benz G3A 6x4 truck chassis. To make it suitable for the armored car, some modifications were necessary, like the addition of a rear driving position, which was something of a trend during the interwar era. The front-mounted six-cylinder petrol engine produced 65 horsepower at 2,600 revolutions per minute, which was later found to be a bit too weak. The power went through a main and secondary transmission, which provided 8 forward and 5 reverse gears. The top speed was 65 kilometers per hour, or 40 miles per hour. Only the 2 rear axles were driven, while the front axle was steered. The armored body was placed on the chassis, but could be removed to facilitate easier chassis maintenance. Also, it was designed with as many angled plates as possible to increase the effectiveness against projectiles. The front had the thickest armor with 9 mm, or 1/3 of an inch. The sides and rear were 2 mm thinner, so 7 mm or 1/4 of an inch. The commercial versatility allowed several armament configurations. As such, all L181s had a front-hull machine gun, but the Dutch version also had one in the rear. The turret was equipped with a small caliber gun and a coaxial machine gun. An L181 was typically manned by a crew of 5. A driver and machine gunner sat to the front. Behind them, a commander and a gunner were seated in the turret, and a second driver sat at the rear driving position. The concept of dual driving positions originated during the First World War and allowed for easy maneuvering when reversing, at the cost of increased mechanical complexity and, in the case of the L181, an additional crew member. The L181 hit the market in 1933, being on offer until replaced by better models like the L180 and Lynx. During this time, Landsverk secured 2 orders, both from neutral European countries. Lithuania was a brand new country as it had gained independence in 1918. By 1919, it maintained a small armored car fleet, but these old vehicles became more obsolete with each passing year. In 1933, the decision was made to replace them, and so an order for 6 L181s was placed in December. The army wanted them to be armed with 2 8mm Maxim machine guns and 1 20mm Oerlikon cannon, which was already in service. In April 1935, all ordered vehicles were shipped to Lithuanian ports. The army organized them into a company composed of 3 platoons. These platoons were then attached to the 3 cavalry regiments and regularly used for training. In 1939, Lithuania fell victim to the German-Soviet conspiracy, where the country was put in the so-called Soviet sphere of influence. On the surface, this didn't sound particularly nefarious, but in reality, it was Germany's green light for a Soviet occupation of Lithuania, which ultimately happened in June 1940. Interestingly, the Lithuanian army was absorbed into the Soviet army, and as such, the L-181s came into Soviet service. Not much changed until the German invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. The Soviet rule in Lithuania was so unpopular that a part of the former Lithuanian army revolted, allied itself with Germany, and attacked the Soviets. 2 L-181s were used against them northeast of Vilnius. One was knocked out, and the other was eventually handed over to the advancing Germans. The other 4 vehicles likely perished in the fight against the Nazis, never to be seen again. The Netherlands was the second and last country to order the L-181. Like Lithuania, they previously only fielded a few obsolete armored vehicles, good only for training. What the army really desired was a modern vehicle that could be used off-road and had a long operational range, which would make it perfect for reconnaissance. After looking at all the options on the European market, the L-181 was chosen in late 1934. Unlike the Lithuanian army, the Dutch army went for an armament of 3 7.92mm Lewis machine guns and one 37mm Bofors gun. Since the gun was larger, the turret had to be larger too. By early April 1936, the 12 vehicles that were ordered had all arrived in the Netherlands and were taken into service with the newly created Armored Car Squadron. They were designated M36 and formed 4 platoons of 3 vehicles each. The Dutch army had a few minor issues with the armored car, like the engine being too weak, but overall, they were rather pleased with the design. This also led to another order of the improved L-180 model, which was accepted into service as the M38. Meanwhile, the M36s were put through their paces in training exercises. With the ever-rising tensions in Europe, the Armored Car Squadron was mobilized in April 1939. Seeing the swift German attacks on Scandinavian airfields in April 1940, the Dutch High Command decided to bolster their airfield's defenses, a task for which the armored cars were considered to be particularly suited for. Therefore, the squadron was split, with half going to Schiphol Airport near Amsterdam and the other half going to Ypenburg Airfield near The Hague, the seat of government. In the early morning of 10th May 1940, the German attack finally came. At 2 a.m., the alarm was first raised at Schiphol, so the 6 cars stood ready when the German bombers came around 4 a.m. One M36 was slightly damaged, but the rest left the attack unscathed. The vehicles were not allowed to shoot unless the German paratroopers started landing, as it was feared that the projectiles would miss and hit the various civilian aircraft that were parked in the fields surrounding the airstrip. Against expectations, a German landing force never came, and the 6 cars were not used in further hostilities. Meanwhile, the alarm was also raised at Ypenburg, resulting in a battle that's honestly worthy of a dedicated video of its own. The first bombings began around 4 a.m., causing trouble to the armored cars. One had ended up in a bomb crater and got stuck, while another suffered a malfunction to the gun's aiming equipment, rendering its most important weapon useless. Assuming the bombings had done enough, the Germans began to land with planes on the airfield itself. To their surprise and horror, they found the Landsverks waiting for them, and 3 waves of landing planes were shot up before all further landings were cancelled. However, German airborne troops and paratroopers had also successfully landed in the vicinity and were now grouping up and advancing on the airfield. By the end of the morning, most of the airfield had been captured. One by one, the cars were being taken out of action or abandoned, with 2 survivors retreating from the airfield. In the afternoon, the Dutch army had recollected itself and counterattacked, clearing the airfield of Germans by the evening of the same day. However, the armored cars hadn't participated in this attack, as just one was still fully operational by this time. The next day, the unit was ordered to The Hague, while the 3 abandoned cars were retrieved from the airfield. In the following days, the various damages were repaired, returning all 6 cars back to operation. However, they were only used sparingly for patrol and guard duties. Following the devastating bombardment on Rotterdam on 14th May, the Netherlands surrendered. In accordance with the conditions of the surrender, military equipment was not destroyed or disabled to prevent capture. The armored squadron had laid down their arms, handing over the vehicles to the Germans. Although worn by heavy use, the 12 M36s were all operational, and the Germans were happy to incorporate them into their own forces. The exact number of used vehicles isn't known, but photographs of their use by the Germans are common. Additionally, the German Order Police got its hands on 3 pieces, which were used by a police unit in Amsterdam. In June 1941, the 3 vehicles were relocated to the Eastern Front and deployed in the rear area. At least 1 vehicle was captured by the Soviets before the vehicles were relocated again, this time to a depot in Vienna. From there, a new platoon of 3 was formed and deployed to the Balkans in 1943, where they remained in action until the end of the war. In May 1945, the platoon retreated to Austria, never to be heard of again. And with that, we have not only reached the end of the L181's story, but also of this video. Thank you for keeping up with us yet another time. If you haven't done so already, we invite you to subscribe to stay updated on future content. If you'd like to contribute further, consider supporting us on Patreon or PayPal. We want to especially thank our medium and heavy tank Patreon supporters: Alex Harvey, Andrew Alberg, Dan Fitzpatrick, Dave Schuford, Joe, Leslie Holkower, Michael Herman, Owen M., Peter Bradbury, and the Sasquatch. Until next time, keep us in your sight.